I'm going to talk a little bit about bioenergy and specifically UK biomass for energy, because as I'll show you, our work on the UK energy system and how we best get to meeting our carbon reduction targets by 2050 involves quite a bit of biomass for energy. You'll be pleased to hear. But I thought I'd just start with a few numbers to kind of set the context for this talk, and these are kind of things that I think, sort of orders of magnitude to have in your mind when you think about these issues. Total value of UK agriculture and forestry production as a percentage of GDP, about 0.7%. The agriculture sector, the entire value of production in the UK agriculture and forestry sector. Our work on the value of the biomass for energy to the UK energy system by about 2050, roughly 0.7% of GDP. So the value of biomass for energy is potentially as big or greater than the total value of everything that's produced in the UK agricultural sector. Agriculture is also a heavily subsidised sector, so the value of subsidies into agriculture in the UK, roughly about 3.4 billion, mainly not coupled to production, income support mainly, about 20% for sort of rural development type objectives. And in terms of land, there's quite a lot of land under agriculture in the UK, 17 million hectares, 71% of our land area. This is really just to kind of frame the approach that I've taken in looking at this work. What I'm trying to do is not do any more science, any more modelling, generate any kind of fundamental new insights, but really work with the core insights that have come out of ETI's work on the energy system and in particular the role of bioenergy in that. Work those through to logical conclusions. And I think that also takes you in a direction where you're challenging what I've seen in many parts of the sort of energy policy world as received wisdom, trying to get engagement with what I think is an overlooked agenda, and then thinking about, well, if you take the case seriously for a substantial role for biomass for energy in achieving decarbonisation, then what are the logical implications of that in terms of policy? Many of you will be familiar, I think, with ETI's work on energy system modelling, but this is for those who are not so familiar with that. We have built and run a national energy system model of the UK energy system. So that's not just the electricity sector, but heat, transport, industry, infrastructure. And this is a cost optimising approach. So this enables us, I think, to take a fairly rigorous approach to looking at the most advantageous, least cost, most economic combination of technologies to deliver a low carbon energy system by 2050 for the UK. It's a fairly credible piece of kit. It's used widely by DEC, by the Committee on Climate Change, and a number of academic partners work with ESME and some of the other modelling tools that ETI projects have produced. Just to illustrate the point I was making earlier about the value of UK agricultural production and the very high value of potentially greater than 1% by 2050, 1% of GDP. In terms of the value of deploying bioenergy applications effectively across the energy system, this is the difference in the cost of a low carbon energy system that makes. So if you assume that you've got no bioenergy just doesn't take off and you're not able to deploy biomass for energy, then to meet your low carbon energy targets, it's going to cost you an extra something like 1%, potentially more actually in some of our recent modelling runs, 1% of GDP more to deliver your low carbon energy needs. So that's really a very substantial figure. So high value for the role of bioenergy within the UK energy system. In terms of why that's so, the next two slides I'm just trying to intuitively set out why it is that biomass for energy is so valuable. A lot of people find that difficult to believe. The reasoning is that really is to do with the wide range of applications biomass for energy can play within the energy system. It's very flexible, versatile. It has applications in heat, power, gas, liquid transport fuels, a whole range of applications. Another big part of the value that our energy system modelling shows is the value of biomass with CCS to deliver negative emissions, and this is very valuable because it means that it enables the continued use of fossil fuels in applications in perhaps particularly in the transport sector, but also in heat, where it's very expensive to replace those. So all of that, I think, depends upon the ability to demonstrate convincingly that the value chains delivering biomass for energy do not lead to emissions elsewhere, which outweigh emissions reduction in energy production. So you're into all those debates about land use change, ILUC, etc., etc. This is, again, I think, trying to communicate why it is that biomass is valuable to the energy system. It's around its versatility. It's flexible and dispatchable in ways that other renewable technologies are not, and that negative emissions pathway in the long run is extremely valuable. Then in terms of, we've also used our bioenergy value chain model, which a number of presenters have talked about, to kind of create pictures of what that looks like in terms of the potential deployment of bioenergy in the UK in 2050. If we're looking at optimal low carbon energy systems, this slide kind of gives you a summary of that. So we've got fairly widespread production in the UK of energy crops. We've got production of biomass into hydrogen, and also bioenergy with CCS in a number of clusters delivering those negative emissions. So really, this is you can sort of take this, if you like, as the sort of optimal utopian view of what bioenergy could be in 2050 in the UK. If we lived in this world where everything was optimized and we had perfect foresight, and bioenergy was clearly demonstrated that it didn't have any adverse land use change impacts elsewhere, this is the kind of role that we could see for it. One of the things we've focused on particularly, though, is the case for UK biomass. So why is it that we should worry particularly about producing biomass in the UK? And I think in thinking about how we could get to that substantial role for bioenergy in the UK energy system, there are really quite large risks in relying totally on imports to supply that. And there's a range of reasons why that's so. The sort of carbon accounting and scientific understanding points are around these issues, indirect land use change, which look very challenging, not insurmountable, but very challenging, and particularly from a political point of view, I think they carry risks in terms of being able to make the case convincingly in a way that secures enough political and social support for this sort of role for biomass for energy. So I think there's a big role for developing local production, UK domestic production of biomass for energy, to help mitigate some of these risks around the political sustainability of large-scale imported biomass to support that kind of scale of bioenergy in the UK. And also in terms of future global markets as well. If the world moves to a widely shared carbon reduction agenda, then sustainable biomass, sustainable bioenergy could become a very valuable traded commodity, and actually the UK's ability to access enough of that in sufficient quantity to support that scale of application of bioenergy in the UK energy system could become quite risky. So there's an energy security aspect to this. I think looking at the high level, many of you will be familiar with these types of arguments around production of biomass in the UK or even elsewhere in Europe, that land is available. There is high level evidence that there is sufficient land available and that there's scope to accommodate biomass for energy in a land use system where you're combining that with increasing the productivity of land use in a way that is demonstrably sustainable. There are clearly a range of issues, and we've heard presentations around that. But at the high level, there is nothing to suggest that there isn't scope to do this. And our work on the UK energy system suggests that even a relatively small biomass sector in the UK could be very valuable in terms of its impact on the overall costs of the energy system. So there's a substantial opportunity for the UK to realise economic value by developing a significant scale domestic biomass production sector. And there's also an opportunity to address some of these issues around the political, social sustainability of biomass for energy, because if you're building value chains in your own domestic environment, you're able to shape the policy and the regulation in ways that builds those value chains in ways that are clearly sustainable with acceptable impacts on emissions or ecosystem services and so on. So I'm just going to briefly talk about direct land use change and indirect land use change, because these are big challenges from the point of view of demonstrating the sustainability of biomass for energy. On direct land use change, ETI has invested in the ELAM project, Ecosystem Land Use Modelling Project, which I think has helped to give us a greater degree of knowledge and authority in this area together with our partners. And that gives us clear evidence, empirically strong evidence, I would argue, on the likely scale of the emissions impacts associated with a range of the land use transitions that you would need to look at to develop the UK biomass sector. The impacts are variable, in some cases material, so the policy implication is that the incentives to undertake those land use transitions should be shaped in a way that promotes planting of biomass where it makes most sense from an emissions point of view. But I think perhaps more importantly, the overall impact and the bigger picture is that the scale of those direct land use change emissions impacts is not a big deal. It's a second order issue in terms of the overall impact on the energy system. So we've done sensitivity analysis on from an energy system point of view, and the value of biomass to the energy system is still very robust, even if you assume that there are higher direct land use change emissions impacts associated with biomass production. It's still an economically efficient way of saving emissions, and even some grassland transitions at the kind of levels of direct land use emissions impacts associated with some of those transitions still look favourable from an overall energy system point of view. In terms of indirect land use change, we're back to that, the favourite food versus fuel type argument. And I think a lot of the issues here are around, firstly, I think delivering and focusing on developing a UK domestic biomass sector helps to address some of the risks around indirect land use change type arguments. Lowering the potency of those arguments by introducing biomass in a way that improves overall land use productivity, I think, helps with these kinds of arguments. So you have the sort of let's grow energy crops on marginal land type arguments. Yes, that's part of it. But there's also, I think, a wider agenda around integrating into existing agricultural systems in ways that improves overall land use productivity. And I think there's a big agenda there. And doing that, I think, would help with those political and societal acceptability arguments around indirect land use change. So in terms of policy implications, I think that takes you in the direction of integrating policy for biomass for energy with wider incentives to promote and improve agricultural efficiency, with land use-based policies around things like nitrogen vulnerable zones, catchment management, looking for these opportunities, and we've heard a number of really interesting presentations around the multiple benefits of introducing biomass for energy crops. And I think also that you're likely to see different kinds of value chains making sense in different circumstances. Just quickly, these are a couple of charts I've filleted out of reports looking at the performance of UK agriculture, and I think these show clearly there is a agricultural productivity in the UK. There's plenty of scope to improve it, I think, at a high level. So we can see the UK here compared with a number of other comparator nations in terms of performance on agricultural productivity over the period since the 60s. We're down at the bottom there compared with Germany, the US and so on. And then this wide range of input-output productivity across farms. So there's clearly a tail of farms there with quite low productivity. So there is a productivity agenda which I think is part of this. Okay, so in terms of what could a UK biomass for energy sector look like, the ETI's published a couple of scenarios for the energy system transition as a whole, but focusing in on the role of UK biomass for energy. These are the kinds of scales that we've got in mind. So by the 2030s, something like 3% of primary energy inputs coming from domestic biomass. These sorts of tonnages, quite significant scale. You need to be in this sort of ballpark to get you to this sort of 2050 kind of scale, which realises those very substantial benefits in terms of lowering the cost of UK decarbonisation. So from where we are now, getting to something like, well, what are we talking about? About 800,000 hectares of energy crops by the 2030s. That's a really big challenge from where we are now. That's the sort of level of ambition, I think, that we should have in mind when we're thinking about biomass for energy policy. Where we are now, we've got that £3.5 billion of subsidies going into agriculture. None of it's doing anything to help biomass for energy, which is this route to delivering substantial value to the UK. Looks, on the face of it, very odd. The CAP framework, in particular, I think is not supportive. There is support for biomass, but through energy policy instruments mainly, not through agricultural policy type route. The way that's working is supporting the development of primarily large-scale imports at the moment. This is a sort of economist's view of the kinds of policy challenges that there are. Market failures. We're in a situation, if we want to develop this scale of biomass for energy in the UK, there are many market failures in early markets that you can see. Missing markets, information failures. Overcoming those issues will require policy intervention to develop markets, support services, finance, etc. And that policy will need to bear in mind the point at the transition in which we are. So at the moment, we're in this sort of fragmented, small-scale, uneven world, and we want to move to something that's bigger scale, much more organised, much more ambitious. But we've got to start from where we are now at the moment. So policy needs to be designed with that in mind. You can conceive of it as a sort of this kind of transition in terms of the types of uses and value chains for biomass for energy. So starting off, well, what have we got now? Well, we can do biomass boilers, space heat off the gas grid. Maybe there's some scope for industrial heat, and we've got this imported feedstocks coming into biopower. And then scaling up gradually into things like combined heat and power in the next decade or two. Further industrial use, and then into the 2030s and 40s with larger scale, more sophisticated value chains, and those applications with carbon capture and storage, maybe continued use in space heating in some locations. To do that, other policy challenges that we would need to address would be, I think there's some tensions here around how do we get the right land use transitions, how do we incentivize planting where it makes most sense, and how do we do that in a way that's geographically targeted but doesn't involve too much bureaucracy. I think if we just have blanket incentive, then we could there could be real risks with that, because you'd incentivize plantings in places where it doesn't actually make sense, or you'd revive the food versus fuel argument. You'd get arable land transition into energy crops, and you'd revive all of those risks. So you need some kind of targeting, some sort of finely tuned in policy incentives. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't involve too much bureaucracy? I don't have the answer to that, but I think there are some real policy challenges there. One of the challenges is that farmers are, different. There's thousands of them. Some of them are small scale, some of them are large scale. They're in different starting places. How do you develop incentives that work across a very heterogeneous set of decision makers? So those are real challenges. In the short run, I think the immediate business challenges for me are around we need more biomass for energy. We have, I think, a stunted, potentially stagnating sector in the UK at the moment. It's ignored by policymakers, in fact actively discouraged in some cases, I would say. And there's these issues around confidence again. There are some real challenges for farmers looking to go into these crops. There's an unhappy history. So there's a challenge to improve confidence amongst the existing growers, retain the ones we've got, and then look at, well, how do we get some new people into these markets? So you need to look at it in terms of promising niches, quite fine scale targeting of support and incentives, along with building up end use demand that will create markets for biomass for energy, and improving the support services for growers, while also still having in mind to these sustainability credentials as well, because I think that's very important to maintain that through time. Some very tricky challenges. What are the business models that might work to get you on this transition towards a larger scale sector, where you're into things like heat, off-grid heat markets, on-farm self-supply for things like poultry enterprises and so on, smaller scale heat and power projects, potentially with a mix of imports and local production as well. So you can start maybe some larger scale projects, but start blending in local production, so you can get things started at scale with imported biomass. And then a whole range of issues around developing these very important aggregators and service providers, intermediaries, to help develop the market. And there are a range of business models there, including innovative financing mechanisms to overcome some of these cash flow issues for growers when they first get into the market. So what are the potential policy opportunities? And I think it's important to kind of have a very pragmatic view around, how can we work with the grain of what's there in the policy environment. For me, a lot of it's around joining up energy policy and agricultural policy. So in energy policy, I think bioenergy is there, it's on the agenda, but it's sort of nowhere in terms of agricultural policy. So I think there's a job to be done to get it onto that agenda, and potentially in the short run, are there opportunities to get some of the Pillar 2 funding, the rural development money available through the CAP, into developing some of these early value chains for biomass for energy. Relatively small scale at the outset. I'm not sure, but it seems like certainly an area worth exploring. The renewable heat incentive we've had in the UK, it hasn't done very much. In fact, I think there are features of it that make it quite difficult for that incentive to flow down into encouraging domestic biomass production, but are there ways that that could be adapted to promote demand for domestic biomass, which has good sustainability credentials? I think that's worth exploring and working with that. The RHI, I'm not sure how long that particular policy instrument will survive, but I'm sure there'll be a successor of some kind. And then opportunities to look at how do we integrate it with some of the wider land use initiatives, land use policies, like catchment sensitive farming and so on. I just want to finish up quickly, just again with some numbers. You know, can we afford this? Is it worthwhile from a policy support point of view? Well, we do spend a lot of money on subsidies to agriculture, so it wouldn't take redirecting too much of that into ways that support biomass for energy to be extremely helpful. In terms of energy policy support, you know, there is some big chunky money going into biomass electricity. Hypothetically, if we provided establishment grants and we subsidised domestic production by £50 a tonne, the costs of getting to that large-scale biomass for energy sector that I was talking about by the 2030s, that 800,000 type hectares of biomass for energy, would be around £2.3 billion. That's a big sum of money, but in the context of these other big numbers around, in the context of the tens of billions of pounds of support that have gone into offshore wind, it actually looks pretty good value to me. So there's a case to be made, I think. So my conclusions are, our work at the ETI and I think a lot of the work that people around the room have done shows that there is a very strong case for building a sustainable biomass sector. It's very high value. We need to keep emphasising that. It's high value in terms of the difference it makes to the cost of low carbon energy because of its flexible, dispatchable properties in a low carbon energy system. It's doable in terms of the scale of land use change. We've seen land use change over a couple of decades of a similar scale. We've got, 750,000 hectares of oilseed rape that came in quite quickly. So it is doable. And people who say, oh, there's not enough land available, it's too big a deal, you know, you'll never do it. I'm not sure that that's true. With a strong enough economic driver, driven by strong enough policy, I think it's eminently doable. There is an opportunity to build a sector with high sustainability credentials, which deals with those issues around political and social acceptability. And it generates potentially other benefits in terms of landscape benefits, ecosystem benefits, rural incomes. Policy support costs look affordable. We need to make the policy case, I think. That underlies some of the work that ETI proposes. And just a few questions that I want to leave with people, maybe I'll invite some responses on, are people's thoughts on these questions. What are the most promising immediate policy opportunities to get the sector moving? Is it right to target agricultural policy as the sort of key blind spot at the moment? Is it right to address the food versus fuel issue through a land productivity type argument? What needs to be done to better articulate the case for biomass for energy? These landscape level initiatives, is that a fertile area to go with? How do you stimulate growers to plant where it makes most sense? So those are some of the issues that are in my mind, some of the policy questions that I think we need to move towards getting some kind of simple messages on some of these things. It is a complex and difficult area, bioenergy, by its nature, but I think there's a sort of pragmatic type set of messages and arguments that I'd like to see coming out more clearly.